Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. This time we're getting to something that seems pretty basic at first, events. But you requested a deep dive from like a philosopher's perspective. And wow, it gets complex fast.
It really does. What's so fascinating to me is that we use this idea of events all the time, every day, without even thinking about it.
Right.
But once you start, really analyzing it, you realize that it's actually like this foundational concept to how we understand like reality itself. I mean, everything from cause and effect to even the very nature of time.
Okay, so let's get into it then. Imagine just a simple scenario.
Yeah.
An apple falling from a tree.
Sure.
Pretty standard event, right? Happens all the time.
Absolutely. But even this like basic act, for philosophers raises a ton of questions.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, for example, what actually defines an event? Like, how do we actually separate it from the apple itself, which is an object?
That's a great point, because we think of an apple as like a solid thing. But the falling part feels more like a process or something.
Yeah.
So does that mean events don't really exist the same way that objects do?
That is like a major question that philosophers grapple with. Do they have this independent existence like objects do?
Right.
Or are they more like these fleeting moments, almost like intangible?
It's like trying to hold on to smoke.
Yeah, exactly.
And here's where things get really interesting for me.
Mm-hmm.
What about events that like happen over and over again?
Okay.
Like the sun rising every morning. Is that one giant repeating event or a brand new one each day?
That cuts to the heart of like event identity, right?
Yeah.
Is each sunrise unique even though we describe it in the same way?
Yeah.
And if they are unique, how similar do they need to be to still count as the same kind of sunrise?
Right.
I mean, these are the nuances that philosophers love to debate.
Okay, so hold on, because I'm already getting lost in the weeds here. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy actually categorizes events into these different types, activities, accomplishments, achievements, states. It's like a whole system.
Oh, for sure.
For understanding existence. So how do these categories help us understand what events are?
I think it's fascinating how these categories, they really show how deep events are in our thinking.
Right.
We separate things that are ongoing, like walking, which is an activity, from things that have a clear end.
Yeah.
Like building a house, which is an accomplishment.
Makes sense.
And then you have like those sudden aha moments.
Sure.
Reaching a mountaintop, solving a puzzle. Those are achievements.
So we have all these different types of events, but are they all fundamentally like the same kind of thing?
That's a big question.
The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy mentions that philosophers have spent a lot of time comparing events to other philosophical building blocks, I guess we could say.
Absolutely.
So what are some of the big ones?
Well, one of the most important comparisons is between events and objects.
Okay.
We tend to see objects as existing in this like solid way.
Right.
And events is more about happening.
Hmm.
But are they really that different?
Okay, I kind of see what you mean. Like a chair just is,
Right.
but a birthday party happens.
Exactly.
Although I guess you could argue that a party, with all the decorations and guests, it's like a temporary object, right?
Yeah, that's a really clever observation, and some philosophers actually make that argument.
Oh, wow.
They suggest that the line between objects and events might be a little blurry.
Yeah.
Maybe an object is just a super stable event that doesn't change much, while an event is kind of like an unstable object constantly in flux.
Whoa, that's kind of blowing my mind a little bit. So maybe the difference isn't as clear-cut as we assume?
Maybe not.
But even if we do separate objects and events, how do they relate to each other? I mean, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy mentions some differing views on that.
Yeah. Some philosophers argue that events are totally dependent on the objects involved, right?
So no apple falling.
Exactly. But others propose that it could be the other way around.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Objects might actually depend on events for their existence.
Wait, so objects might need events to exist. That's a real chicken and egg situation. It seems like objects and events are way more intertwined than we initially thought.
Definitely more complex.
But, okay, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy also compares events to facts.
Yes.
So what's the difference there?
That's another key distinction.
Okay.
And it gets at the difference between concrete things that happen and abstract truths.
Okay.
So the event of Caesar's death was a specific thing that occurred at a specific time and place.
Right.
But the fact that Caesar died is true no matter when or where you say it.
So an event is like a snapshot in time.
Yeah.
But a fact is more like this universal truth
Exactly.
existing outside of time. Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. But then the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy brings up some arguments against that separation.
Right.
So are they not so easily categorized after all?
Well, some philosophers argue that events and facts are so closely linked
Yeah.
that they might be different sides of the same coin, you know?
Hmm.
For example, if you see events as, like, equivalent to facts, they become very specific.
Okay.
The fact that Caesar died violently is different from the fact that he died peacefully.
Right.
So are those two distinct events or just two ways of describing the same event?
Okay, I see how that gets tricky.
It does.
So how we describe events seems crucial to figuring out what they actually are.
For sure.
Is that where, like, language comes into play? The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy specifically talks about nominalization.
Absolutely. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy discusses how language, especially nominalization, really plays a role.
Okay.
The difference between saying Caesar died
Right.
and talking about Caesar's death might point to deeper philosophical distinctions.
It's like the very way we talk about events shapes how we think about them.
Exactly.
So all of this makes me wonder, are events ultimately just properties?
Okay.
Like, is redness a property of an apple
Sure.
and falling a property of an event?
That's a really interesting idea. If properties are like universal things that show up in different instances, then events being unique occurrences wouldn't quite fit.
Yeah.
But then we have those recurring events.
Right, like the sunrise.
Like the sunrise every day.
Yeah.
Does that change things?
If we're saying the same event can happen multiple times, maybe events are more like properties. What does the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy say about that?
Well, that's where the concept of event types comes in.
Okay.
Maybe sunrise is a property,
Right.
and each morning sunrise is a specific instance of that property being manifested.
So sunrise is like the blueprint.
Yeah.
And each sunrise we see is like a unique expression of that blueprint.
Wait.
That's a pretty cool way to look at it.
Yeah.
But does that mean each sunrise is a distinct event?
It gets even more complex.
Oh, boy.
Some philosophers go as far as saying that events are essentially properties of times.
Okay.
So this morning's sunrise is just the property of being a time when the sun rises applied to a specific point on the timeline.
Whoa. So events become like time markers then, defining specific moments.
Yeah, in a way.
I'm starting to see how even a simple idea like an apple falling can lead us down some pretty deep philosophical rabbit hole.
Exactly. And we've only just scratched the surface.
Oh, no.
This exploration of events leads to even deeper questions about the nature of time itself.
Really?
If events are properties of time, does that mean time is more fundamental than events? Or could it be the other way around?
You're giving me a lot to think about.
It's a lot to unpack, for sure.
But I love how these like seemingly basic questions about events can lead us to such profound insights.
It really shows the power of philosophy
Yeah,
to make us question the most everyday parts of reality.
absolutely.
And believe me, we've only just begun. It's amazing how much depth there is to something, we experience every day. And speaking of different ways to look at events, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy also brings up this idea of static versus dynamic events.
Right. Dynamic events, those are all about like change,
Yeah.
things happening, moving around, transforming.
Yeah, exactly.
But what about those moments when things are just being like, are those still considered events?
That's the question surrounding static events.
Yeah.
Some philosophers argue that if there's like no change happening, then there's no event. Like a ball just sitting on a table. Right. Nothing's happening to it, so no event.
I see. But what if we're talking about like the event of the ball being red? That's a state of existence, sure, but it still feels like something we could call an event.
That's a great point. And some philosophers do make room for those static events, arguing that even unchanging states can be considered events. They would say, like, the ball being red is different from the ball being blue, even though neither involves movement or change in that specific moment.
So it goes back to how we describe things then, huh?
Yeah.
Maybe it's less about like the physical stuff happening
Right.
and more about how we mentally categorize those happenings.
Exactly. Our language and like our thought processes really influence how we identify and differentiate events.
And speaking of language, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy dives into this fascinating linguistic distinction. Activities versus accomplishments versus achievements.
Oh, yeah. Remember those categories?
Yeah. That's where it gets into how different verbs imply different types of events, right? Like grammar has a hidden code about the nature of reality.
That's a great way to put it. Think about the difference between like walking
Yeah.
and reaching the top.
Ooh.
Walking is an ongoing activity.
Right.
It doesn't have a built-in endpoint. But reaching the top is an accomplishment, like it's a specific goal that gets achieved.
Right.
Right.
You see the difference.
Totally. And then you have those like super quick events, like suddenly realizing something
Yeah.
or making a decision, like in a flash.
Exactly.
Those are the achievements.
Those are the achievements. And the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy highlights how linguists have actually built like whole theories around these subtle differences in how we use verbs.
Oh, wow.
Like the tenses we use, how we structure sentences. It gives us all these clues about the events we're talking about.
So grammar isn't just about rules.
No.
It's about expressing the very nuances of existence.
Exactly. But let's go back to the idea of actions.
Okay.
Those seem like a special kind of event, the kind that involves someone like doing something intentionally.
Right. So are actions just like a subset of events?
Yeah.
Or are they a whole different category?
Well, on the surface, it seems like actions are events, right?
Right.
If I choose to raise my hand and then my hand goes up.
That's an event. But it's also an action because I made it happen.
Right. Because you had the intention.
That's the common sense view, and a lot of philosophers agree with it.
Huh?
But some argue that actions are more complex than that.
Okay.
They might be relations between a person and an event, like the relation of bringing about or making sure that...
So instead of saying, like, I raised my hand, we would say, I brought about the raising of my hand.
Exactly.
Seems like a small difference, but I guess it has big consequences for how we think about free will and responsibility.
You're exactly right. If actions are just events, then they might, follow the same rules of cause and effect.
Right.
Like as anything else, like dominoes falling.
Okay.
But if actions involve this special relationship between a person and an event,
right,
it leaves room for the idea that we have genuine control over our actions.
Wow, we're getting really into the deep end of philosophy now.
We are.
It's amazing how these ideas about events are connected to these huge questions about what it means to be human.
It really is, And to take it even further,
yeah.
the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy also explores the distinction between actions and simply moving your body.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
That's where we get those brain-twisting thought experiments, whether raising your arm is the same event as your arm going up.
It's a classic.
Makes my head spin just thinking about it.
I know what you mean. But it's a really important difference.
Yeah.
Because it gets at what makes an action intentional.
Right.
Is it the physical movement itself, or is it the mental decision that happens before and supposedly causes that movement?
Right. If, my arm twitches randomly, that's not an action.
No.
Even though my arm moved.
Right.
But if I consciously decide to raise my arm, then it is an action, even if the movement looks exactly the same.
Precisely. So how do we account for that difference?
Right, that's the question.
The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy explores a few theories. Some philosophers say that actions are a special type of event that has both a mental part, the intention, and a physical part, the movement. Others say actions are a totally separate category. Maybe a relation between a person and a bodily movement.
So maybe actions are like events with this extra layer of, I meant to do that, sprinkle on top.
Right.
Or maybe there's something else entirely.
It's possible.
It's like solving a philosophical jigsaw puzzle where the pieces keep changing.
That's a great analogy. And the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy doesn't stop there.
Oh, no.
They also get into the distinction between mental events and physical events.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting.
Right.
We've been talking about physical events.
Yeah.
Like apples falling, arms moving.
Sure.
But what about the stuff happening inside our heads? Thoughts, feelings, decisions.
Yeah.
Those internal events that, make us who we are.
Those are mental events.
Okay.
And their relationship to physical events is one of, the biggest mysteries in philosophy.
For sure.
Some argue that mental events are just a special kind of physical event, maybe the same thing as what's happening in our brains.
Okay.
Others say that mental events are, totally separate from physical events, which leads to all sorts of, interesting ideas about dualism.
So is thinking just a bunch of neurons firing?
Yeah.
Or is it something more?
It's a big question, right?
It feels like that question has been haunting philosophers forever.
It really has. And the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy emphasizes how this debate has, huge implications for how we understand consciousness, free will, the whole mind-body problem. If mental events are just physical events, then maybe our inner lives are totally ruled by, the laws of physics. But if mental events are separate, then maybe we have a level of freedom and control that goes beyond the material world.
It's mind-blowing to think that our exploration of events has brought us to these, like, huge questions about the nature of reality and what it means to exist.
It's all connected.
But, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy has one more surprise up its sleeve.
Does it now?
Negative events.
Yes. This is where things get really interesting.
Okay, how so?
We've been focusing on events as things that, happen.
Right.
But what about the things that don't happen?
Okay.
Could those also be considered events?
It seems odd to say that something that didn't happen is an event.
I know, right?
But we definitely talk about them all the time.
We do.
Like we might say someone failed to show up or neglected their duties.
Yeah.
Those sound like events, even though they're about, like, the absence of an action.
Exactly. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy tackles this idea of negative events head on.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Some philosophers argue that our language and, our intuitions point towards negative events being real things.
Yeah.
We talk about them. We try to, count them.
Right.
We say they cause other things, and they seem to play a big role in how we, make sense of the world.
So maybe not doing something is just as much of an event as doing something?
Maybe so.
Like the philosophical version of, what's the sound of one hand clapping?
I love that analogy. And, this whole debate has, big implications for how we understand cause and effect, responsibility, even morality.
Oh, wow.
If negative events are real, then maybe we can be held accountable for things we don't do, just like we are for the things we do.
Wow, this whole discussion about events has been a wild ride. We started with an apple falling, and now we're talking about negative events and the nature of reality. It's incredible how much complexity is hiding in this seemingly simple concept. But before we wrap up, I'm curious about something. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy also mentions that some philosophers actually question the very existence of events. How can they do that after all this?
It's true. After exploring all these different types and categories of events, some philosophers kind of take a step back, and ask whether we should even believe that events are things in the first place. It's like questioning the reality of, chairs and tables.
Right.
But for actions and happenings instead of physical objects.
I can see how that would be a mind-bending concept for philosophers to grapple with. What are some of the arguments they use to challenge the existence of events?
Well, one line of reasoning comes from looking at how we use language, right?
Okay.
The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy points out that the way we talk about events could give us clues about whether they truly exist as separate entities.
So the way we use words might reveal something deep about the nature of reality. That's fascinating.
Exactly. And those who believe in events argue that we're constantly referring to and, quantifying over events in our everyday speech.
Okay.
We say things like, the concert was amazing, or 2 car accidents happened on this street last week.
Sure.
This seems to suggest that events have this, real independent existence apart from, the objects and people involved.
Yeah, it does feel natural to talk about events as if they just exist.
It does, doesn't it?
But I imagine there are counter-arguments to this idea.
There are. Some philosophers argue that we can rephrase our sentences to avoid, directly referring to events.
Okay.
For example, instead of saying, the concert was amazing, we could say, the people at the concert had an amazing time.
Okay.
This kind of shifts the focus away from the event itself and onto the experiences of the individuals involved.
So it becomes this debate about whether our language is reflecting a fundamental truth about reality.
Yeah.
Or if it's just a convenient way to talk about things that are ultimately just objects and their properties.
Precisely. And this whole discussion about the existence of events is tied to the issue of identity criteria.
Right.
If events do exist, how do we determine when 2 events are actually the same event?
Right. We talked about that earlier with Caesar's death.
Yeah.
Was Brutus stabbing Caesar the same event as Caesar dying?
Yeah, exactly.
What about the fall of the Roman Republic? Are
Yeah.
those all separate events or just different ways of describing one giant event?
Exactly. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy explores a range of views on this very issue of event identity.
Okay, so what are some of the main uh, camps, I guess.
Well, you have some philosophers called unifiers who believe that events are more like general categories.
Okay.
They might say that Brutus stabbing Caesar, Caesar dying, and the Republic ending are all like part of the same overarching historical event.
That's a pretty broad way to look at it, isn't it?
It is. It kind of blurs a lot of the distinctions we normally make between different things happening.
Right.
Then on the other side of the spectrum, you have the multipliers.
Okay.
They view events in a more fine-grained, distinct way.
Mm-hmm.
For them, even small changes in like an event's properties or participants would make it a totally different event.
Okay.
So Brutus stabbing Caesar with a knife is a different event from him stabbing Caesar with a sword, for example.
Wow, that's incredibly specific.
It is.
But how do we know where to draw the line? It seems like figuring out event identity could get, like, really complicated.
It definitely can. And as the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy points out, there's no, like, simple answer. Philosophers have proposed all sorts of criteria for determining event identity.
Yeah.
Based on things like cause and effect,
Sure.
location in space and time,
Okay.
even the intentions of the people involved.
So there's no single right answer to the question of event identity. It sounds like our understanding of events is still very much a work in progress.
It absolutely is. And this highlights, the importance of continuing to explore these philosophical questions by carefully analyzing, our language, our intuitions, the logical implications of different theories.
Right.
We can slowly deepen our understanding of events and their role in, like, the fabric of reality.
This deep dive has definitely given me a whole new appreciation for the complexity of events.
It's fascinating stuff.
What seems like such a simple concept turned out to be like a rabbit hole of philosophical puzzles and mind-bending possibilities. It's amazing how much there is to uncover.
I agree. I think the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is a fantastic resource for, navigating these complex ideas.
That for sure.
It offers such a thorough overview of the different perspectives and ongoing debates about the nature of events.
I couldn't agree more. This has been a truly mind-expanding exploration, and it leaves me with so many new questions to ponder. Like, if we accept that events don't have, like, a fixed essential nature, does that mean the past is less set in stone than we think? Could that apple have actually not fallen, even though, we know it did?
That's a fantastic question to leave our listener with. It really drives home how these, like, seemingly abstract philosophical discussions have profound implications for, how we understand the world around us.
So to everyone listening out there, I encourage you to keep exploring this fascinating world of events. You never know what other amazing insights and thought-provoking questions await you. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.